The wineglass was already in his hand when the girl said it. "Don't drink that, Mr. Calloway." Everyone at the table heard it. The room went still in that particular way. Rooms go still when a child says something that doesn't belong at a formal dinner, when the voice is too small for the moment and the words are too large. Conrad Whitfield set the glass down, not because he believed her, because 40 years of reading courtrooms had trained him to pause before anything unexpected. He looked at the girl. She was 9, maybe 10, standing near the serving station in a pale yellow dress with a collar that was slightly too stiff, the kind of dress a parent irons twice before a big event. She was staring at his glass, not at him, at the glass. Her name was Addie, Adelaide Perrin. She was the granddaughter of Sylvie Perrin, who had been Conrad's housekeeper for 11 years, and who had brought Addie along tonight because the regular babysitter had canceled, and there was no one else, and Sylvie had been too embarrassed to say so until she arrived. Conrad hadn't minded. He rarely minded things that didn't affect the outcome of an evening. Tonight's dinner was not a party. It was more precise than that. It was a gathering of 7 people in the dining room of Conrad's house in Westmount, the house with the old oak floors and the tall windows that looked out onto a garden that was just beginning to go brown at the edges in the October chill. 7 people who each mattered, in different ways, to the question of what would happen to Whitfield and Associates once Conrad stepped back from it. He had not announced his retirement. He had told no one. But he was 63 years old, and his left knee ached in the mornings, and he had started reading novels again for the first time since law school. And these were not nothing. The 7 people at the table that night were his senior partner, Owen Marsh, his daughter, Claudine, who had flown in from Vancouver, his nephew, Gregory Whitfield, who had worked at the firm for 6 years and believed he was the natural successor, the firm's longtime accountant, Bertrand Loisel, a junior partner named Vivienne Saul, who was sharp in the way that made other lawyers nervous, his oldest friend, a retired judge named Patrick Osey, and Gregory's wife, Margot, who laughed too quickly and watched everything with small, careful eyes. Sylvie moved quietly between kitchen and table. Addie sat in the corner with a book she wasn't reading. The wine had been opened 20 minutes earlier. It was a 2015 Burgundy that Conrad kept for occasions he considered worth remembering. He had poured the first glass himself from the bottle that had been brought up from the cellar by Gregory, who had insisted on doing it, who had said, "Let me, Uncle Conrad. I know the one you mean," with the particular enthusiasm that Conrad had registered and filed away without yet knowing what to do with. That was the glass Addie was staring at. "Why not?" Conrad asked. He kept his voice neutral. He was very good at neutral. Addie looked at Sylvie, who had come to the doorway of the kitchen, and was watching with an expression that was caught somewhere between apologetic and afraid. "Addie," Sylvie said softly. "Come here, sweetheart. She can answer." Conrad said. He wasn't sure why he said it. It wasn't kindness, exactly. It was the same instinct that made him let a witness speak when everyone else in the room wanted them to stop. Addie took one step forward. She was very composed for a child, the way children are sometimes composed when they have spent a lot of time around adults who were not paying attention to them. She pointed at the glass, not dramatically, just with one small finger extended. "I saw Mr. Gregory put something in it," she said. "When he brought the bottle in, he didn't see me. I was behind the cabinet. The table did not erupt. It went quieter. That specific silence that follows a sentence that cannot be unsaid." Gregory laughed. It was a good laugh, practiced, warm, just the right volume. "Uncle Conrad, come on. She's a child." "She was probably half asleep," Addie said. "Addie." Sylvie stepped into the room. "I'm so sorry, Mr. Whitfield. She sometimes—" "Sylvie." Conrad held up one hand without looking away from his glass. "Please." Patrick Osey, who had been a judge for 22 years and had the patience of limestone, leaned back in his chair and said nothing, which was its own kind of statement. Vivienne Saul had her hands flat on the table. She was looking at Gregory. Gregory Whitfield was 34 years old. He had his grandfather's name and his grandfather's jaw and the comfortable certainty of a man who had always assumed that the good things would arrive eventually and in his direction. He had worked at the firm for 6 years, not because he was hungry for it, but because it was the thing that had been waiting for him. He had been patient. He had been present. He had said the right things at the right moments and smiled when smiling was called for, and he had waited. Tonight was supposed to have been the beginning of what he had been waiting for. He looked at Addie with an expression that was trying to be kind and landing somewhere closer to irritated. "Little girl," he said, "I think you might have been dreaming." "Gregory," Conrad said, and something in his voice changed. Not anger, not accusation, something quieter and more final. "If she's wrong, you won't mind asking Bertrand to take the glass to a lab tomorrow morning." Bertrand Loisel, who had been counting ceiling boards for the past 30 seconds, looked up. "That's..." Gregory started. If she's wrong, Conrad said again. Then we open another bottle, we finish the evening, and I'll apologize to Addie for the disruption. He looked at his nephew. So, do you mind? There was a silence that lasted exactly long enough. Then Gregory pushed back his chair and said that this was insane, and that he didn't have to sit here while a 10-year-old child made accusations. And that Uncle Conrad had always had a habit of listening to the wrong people, and that this, he gestured broadly at the table, the room, the evening. This was why the firm was losing ground. He was still talking when he walked out. The room stayed quiet for a moment after the front door closed. Outside, they could hear his car in the driveway. Margot had not moved. She was sitting very still with both hands in her lap, looking at the place where her husband had been sitting, and her expression was not the expression of a woman defending her husband. It was the expression of a woman deciding something. Then Patrick Ossie said, "Well," and Vivian Saul said, "Bertrand." And Bertrand Lawsell picked up the glass. What they found 3 days later was not a poison. That is not what this story is. The lab results showed traces of a sedative compound, something that would not have killed Conrad, but would have made him confused, slow, easy to manage in the hours that followed. Easy to steer toward a conversation that Gregory had apparently been planning. A conversation about succession documents, about a transfer of managing partnership that Gregory had drafted with the help of a solicitor whose name Conrad did not recognize over the previous 4 months. Margot, it turned out, had known. Not everything, but enough. She had known about the documents. She had seen the vial in Gregory's jacket pocket 2 weeks earlier and had asked him about it and accepted an explanation she had chosen, she said later, to believe. She told this to Conrad's lawyer, not Conrad himself, in a meeting that lasted 2 hours and left her looking like someone who had set down something very heavy. She had not known, she insisted, what he intended to do with it, but she had known he had it. Conrad did not confront Gregory directly. That was not how he operated. He had spent 4 decades building cases, and he understood the difference between knowing something and being able to do something with what you know. He let the process move at its own pace. He made certain calls. He contacted the Law Society. He had a conversation with Patrick, who knew the right people, who knew the right steps. He told Claudine in a phone call that lasted 20 minutes and ended with Claudine saying, "Papa, you should have called me before this dinner," which was fair. He had not argued. He told Sylvie in person in the kitchen on a Thursday morning. He told her that none of this was her fault and that Addie had been braver than most adults he knew. Sylvie had started to cry quietly, the way people cry when they've been holding something for several days, and Conrad had said nothing and waited. He was good at waiting. He sat with Addie on a Saturday afternoon, 2 weeks after the dinner, in the living room with the tall windows and the garden outside that was now fully brown. He had bought a jigsaw puzzle, 500 pieces, birds of the Canadian Rockies, because he hadn't known what else to bring, and because he remembered that children liked things to do with their hands. He didn't know this for certain. He had no grandchildren. But it seemed right. Addie took the box and examined the picture on the front with the seriousness of a contractor reviewing blueprints. "Mountain bluebird," she said, pointing. "They're actually kind of rare in Ontario." My teacher says if you see one, it means you've been paying attention." Conrad thought about that for a moment. "Your teacher is right," he said. They worked on the puzzle for an hour. Addie was methodical. She sorted the edge pieces first without being told, and when Conrad put a piece in the wrong place, she said, "I don't think that fits," and was correct, and did not make him feel foolish about it. At some point, without planning to, he said, "Were you scared? When you said something?" Addie pressed a piece into place and considered the question with the same seriousness she gave to the puzzle. "A little," she said, "but it seemed worse not to." Conrad nodded. He thought about his left knee and the novels he had been reading and the garden going brown. He thought about the firm and Vivian Saul, who had been sharp and steady and had not looked away during any of it. He thought about all the years he had spent reading rooms, reading people, reading the precise weight of what was said and what wasn't. He had read Gregory correctly in the end. He had seen the enthusiasm with which Gregory offered to get the wine, and he had filed it away. And he had not known what to do with it. He had needed a 9-year-old girl who stood behind a cabinet and paid attention to know what to do with it. It occurred to him that this was not a small thing. The formal proceedings against Gregory took most of the winter. Conrad did not discuss them publicly. He did not speak to journalists or give interviews. He showed up where he was required to show up and said what needed to be said and left. Margot moved into her sister's house in November. The marriage, like most things that had been held together by the assumption that nothing would change, did not survive contact with the truth. Gregory maintained for some time that the substance was not what the lab said it was, and then that Conrad had misunderstood his intentions, and then that the whole thing had been blown out of proportion by people who had never liked him. His solicitor withdrew from the case in January. He retained a new one. The process continued without him being able to stop it. Vivian Saul was offered the managing partnership in February. She accepted it with a directness that Conrad appreciated. She did not perform gratitude or surprise. She had expected to earn it eventually and had been prepared when eventually arrived. They had a meeting in his office and discussed the transition, and she asked sharp questions and he answered them, and neither of them wasted the other's time. "You're not leaving entirely," she said. It was not a question. "Consulting," he said, selectively. She considered this. "That's fine, but I need you to mean it when you stay out of things. I usually mean what I say. I've noticed. I'm saying it anyway." He liked her. He always had. In March, when the garden was beginning to consider coming back, Conrad set up a trust. He had drafted the papers himself, which was unusual. Most lawyers with anything approaching wisdom do not draft their own documents, but he wanted to understand every line of it. It was a small trust, not enormous. But it was structured carefully, and it was designed to grow. It was in Addie's name. He told Sylvie about it on a Thursday morning, which had become, without either of them deciding, the time for difficult conversations. Sylvie sat with her hands wrapped around her coffee cup and listened without interrupting, which was something Conrad had come to respect enormously. "You didn't have to," she said, when he finished. "I know. She's going to ask me what it's for." "Tell her it's for university," Conrad said, "and that she earned it by paying attention." Sylvie was quiet for a moment. Outside, a bird landed on the fence at the edge of the garden. It was very blue and small, and it sat there for a few seconds before flying off again. Neither of them mentioned it, but they both saw it. Conrad Whitfield did not retire that year. He had planned to in a loose way, the kind of plan that exists more as a feeling than a schedule. But the winter had taken more of his attention than he expected, and the spring was busy, and Vivian had questions sometimes that were easier to answer in person, and the novels weren't going anywhere. He stayed. Not because he had to, because he chose to. He told Patrick this over dinner one evening in April at a restaurant near McGill where they had been eating for 20 years, at a corner table, that they always requested and were just always, and then said, "You were always going to stay. You just needed something to make you stop pretending you weren't." Conrad thought about disagreeing. He did not find a strong argument. "She knew," he said instead. He wasn't sure if he meant Vivienne or Addie or someone else entirely. Patrick seemed to understand that the sentence wasn't finished and didn't push it. They ordered dessert. They talked about other things. Outside, the city was doing what it always did in April, attempting spring, uncertain of its commitment to the idea, throwing light around in directions that felt provisional. Conrad walked home. It took 40 minutes, and his knee ached at the 20-minute mark, as it always did, and he stopped for a moment at the corner of Sherbrooke and looked up at the sky, which was doing something interesting with the last of the evening light. He thought about a 10-year-old girl, sorting edge pieces and telling him that a mountain bluebird meant you had been paying attention. He thought that there were worse things to carry through a life than the knowledge that someone small had seen clearly when you hadn't, and had said so anyway, and had been right. He kept walking.